What's up, everyone? This week we're talking about 4 ideas that sort of punch above their weight class. These are ideas that sound pretty hip, but are actually pretty easy to play on the horn. So when we're looking to add some interesting or quote-unquote hip sounding things into our playing, it's not all about just learning the most complicated scale or the most advanced harmonic concept. A lot of times it's about applying simple foundational concepts in new or creative ways and just executing them really, really well. Before we jump into things today, I want to ask all of you who support this channel for just a tiny little favor. I really appreciate all the support you give me here, watching the videos, hitting like, all that type of stuff. For those of you who support me on Patreon, I really appreciate you checking out stuff over there as well. But in addition to my work here as sort of an educator and as a teacher, I do also maintain, kind of a full playing schedule as well, and that's what I want to talk to you about today. For the last year or so, I've been kicking around with a new band that I started that's sort of a, maybe prog jazz might be the best way to describe it. It's kind of like a progressive rock band populated by jazz musicians with trombone as the lead voice, which is a bit eclectic, but we've had some really great response at our shows over the last year, and I'm trying to push that group a little farther forward from a booking standpoint. With that in mind, if you want to do me a solid, head down to the description. There's a link to a Facebook page, Instagram page. Just click on those and hit like. For better or for worse here in the modern world, booking agents, talent buyers, that type of stuff, they need to see an active social media footprint for the bands that they work with. And I'm just trying to pump up those numbers a little bit as I get a little more serious about trying to book this band sort of in the latter half of this year and moving forward. The group is called Canaries. I actually posted a few videos of this band back in the fall under a different name. I actually had to recently change the name. That was part of my sort of updating the group or trying to push the group forward. There was another band already working under our old name, which was Glass Cactus, and they took up a lot of the social media space. So if you enjoy the work I do here and you want to say, you know what, Shawn's a good guy, I'm going to help him out a little bit, just head on over those links, hit subscribe or hit like, whatever that kind of stuff. I won't spam you or anything like that. It's really just to help bump those numbers a little bit, and hopefully there'll be some cool things coming in the future with this group. Okay, with that out of the way, let's get into what we're actually dealing with today. So we've got these 4 different ideas we're going to work on today. There's going to be a major idea, a minor idea, a 2-5-1 idea, and then 1 chord substitution idea on the blues. These are all things that are relatively easy to execute on your horn. They don't require a ton of music theory knowledge. They're some of the more simple things that I know that I think actually sound hipper than they are. So let's start with the major one, and we'll go through each one of these, break them down, and talk about how you can practice them. All right, to start with our major idea. This is something that works in any major key. You can play it on actually a major chord, or you could play it sort of across chords that are in one key. The example you're going to hear in a second is actually over a 2-5-1 in the key of E flat. What it is a chunk of the major pentatonic scale in a 5-note grouping. So why is this easy? Why is it complex? Why does it really work? It's easy because it's only 5 different notes. It's the 5th, the 6th, the root, the 9, and the 13th, or excuse me, the 3rd. Very, very simple idea. But when you combine it into these 5-note groupings and you're playing as 8th notes or 16th notes, it really sounds more interesting than it is because it sort of staggers where that sort of resolution in time is. And especially when you stretch this out over a number of bars, it's kind of like a hemiolo, which just makes it feel rhythmically interesting. Now, as I already mentioned, it works great if it's just a major chord. It works great on a 2-5-1 like we just heard. It also actually works really great in a minor key. So if we thought about what the relative minor of E flat would be, it would be C minor. So instead of thinking about starting on the 5th, you would start on the flat 7, the B flat. The lick would actually stay the same. It would just have sort of a different chord it's working against. So it would be in C minor, so we'd be thinking about the C minor pentatonic. So maybe the flat 7, the root, the flat 3rd, the 4th, and the 5th to complete this idea. But the rhythmic aspect of it would be exactly the same. Now, this one is almost like a non-lick. It's very, very simple, so it could seem like, well, do I really need to practice this in all 12 keys? I would say yes, you probably would be served well to do so, especially with a metronome, to see if you can really keep that time locked in, especially over multiple bars, so that way it both sounds good from a melodic standpoint, but feels good from a rhythmic standpoint. Okay, cool. On to our second idea. Now, this one is a minor pentatonic idea. So we might call this alternating diatonic thirds in the minor pentatonic scale. Now that can seem kind of complicated, but at its heart, it's really actually pretty simple if you take a little time to work those pentatonic scales. What we have is when we're talking about a diatonic third, we're not necessarily just playing like scales in thirds like we would with a major scale, we're playing diatonically to this scale. So essentially every other note. We take that and then we alternate. So we go up the first one, C to F, and then we go down that second grouping, a G to an E flat. And then we go up the next one, F to B flat, down the next one, C to G. So that's why we're alternating. So to start with the practice, you'd probably just want to practice your diatonic thirds in the pentatonic scale. That's actually sounds great as well. But when you add this alternating aspect to it, it starts to sound pretty interesting from a melodic standpoint. I think actually a pretty significant part of the modern jazz language is manipulating pentatonic scales in this sort of way. Now, if we put this into practice, we're not just going to sit there and plug the pattern in. That's not going to be super, super interesting, not very musical. Instead, we might, sort of weave around it, especially if we're playing on a tune that has like a long section of minor chords. And that way we can apply this sound without it just sounding like we are cutting and pasting into the tune. Now, I can tell you this is probably the most complicated one that we're going to talk about today. So put some practice on it, just doing those regular diatonic thirds in a minor pentatonic, then see if you can do it alternating, and then see if you can apply it. That is the pathway to success on this sort of thing. All right, on to our third idea. This is a 2-5-1. Now, oftentimes 2-5-1s are the most common place where we work on these sort of licks or very, very defined ideas, and I wanted to include one because of that, but there are actually all these other avenues that we can take to work on developing, our improvisational language. So make sure you don't get over-focused on 2-5-1s. They are important, but there's a lot of other stuff going on as well. So to start with, our idea sounds like this. As we can see in here, it's really just two little motives. It's a whole step down and then it jumps down by a fourth. Or we could think on the first chord, we're starting on the 9, going from the 9 to the root, down to the 5th. And then on the second chord, we're maintaining that shape, but we are starting on some less typical chord tones, or chord tones that are going to allow us to access more of the alterations. The way I chose to do it here, I moved it up a half step. So then I start on the flat 7 of B flat, but in my mind, I'm thinking that that is the 9 of the new key center. So now that is the 9 of G flat. So then I go A flat to G flat, down to the 5th of G flat, which is D flat, and then I sort of moved through that C flat to resolve the B flat. Now, that's a little bit of music theory. The great thing about this lick, you could just think you're moving the entire first bar up a half step. That's where it can be really simple, as a simple way to access this more interesting sound. So the G moves up to an A flat, the F moves up to a G flat, and the C moves up to a D flat, and then you just have to resolve to E flat in, a smooth way. Now, there's a couple ways you could vary or extend this to even find a little bit more sort of like interesting colors on some of these chords. One of my favorite ones is to sort of keep this process going and jump up even another half step after that. By doing this, I'm able to access the sharp 11 on that E flat chord, down to the major 7. All this is just a great way to take a motive that's pretty simple, just going 9 root to 5, moving it up by a half step, or maybe by 2 half steps in this case, to find some other sounds. It's inherently melodic, and also just thinking about taking those simple 3 notes and moving them, you're kind of getting the easiest way to get from point A to point B to point C, rather than necessarily thinking about all that music theory. That music theory is going to help you as well, but sometimes a simpler path might be better, and especially in this case, a more melodic path. All right, our fourth and final idea for today is a little reharm on the first 4 bars of the blues. This is what I've talked about before on this channel. Last fall I released a series of videos about playing the blues, sort of like different levels, and this was in the reharm video, but we'll talk about it again today because I do think it is a relatively simple way to find some new sounds on the blues. What we're going to do is we're going to look at the first 4 bars. And rather than just going like 1, 4, 1, 1 for those first 4 bars, one of the common subs is to move down a whole step each measure. Each one of those is going to be a dominant 7th chord. When we do this and we get to the 4th bar, we actually hit a dominant 7th chord that is the tritone sub, getting us to 4. So in our case of B flat, we have a B flat chord, down a whole step to an A flat chord, down a whole step to a G flat chord, and then finally for the 4th bar, down a whole step to an E7 chord. That is a tritone sub that gets us to E flat. Now, if you don't know all that music theory, again, it's all good. The quickest way to possibly get this might just to be, okay, I'm just gonna move down a whole step for each one of those and then build ideas on each one of those chords. To get started on this, I would just worry about the triads to do so. It's a great way to build simple melodies. So you might want to start by just playing triad arpeggios slowly out of time. From there, you can turn it into some sort of more swinging rhythm, still maybe with no play along, or maybe not strictly in time, or at the very least, very slow. Now I did add one extra note in there at the end just to sort of like round off the phrase, but I totally wouldn't have had to. You still could have resolved right to that B flat at the end of that line. So then you put it with a play along and you try to superimpose this over those first 4 bars. Now a play along may or may not have this reharm in it, so you might be really fighting against the harmony if you're working with a play along. But if you're playing with real musicians and they're sort of relatively informed jazz musicians, if you make this really clear, especially by playing triads, they're probably going to go along with you. So that's our simplest form. If we want to make this a little more complex, have a little more variation, maybe you add just one extra note to each one of those triads. Not even a 7th chord, just add the 9 to each one. So you get the root, the 9, the 3rd, and the 5th. We might call that a tetrachord. And that can give you a ton of good shapes to use and ways to manipulate this idea. Once you feel good about keeping those motives very similar as you work down through the chords, then you can start to vary direction, vary whether you use all the chord tones. If you use the 9 in each one of those, you can extend to other chord tones as well, but that might end up sounding like this. Suddenly, this very simple idea of just descending a whole step through each one of those chords, at least to my ear, sounds pretty interesting and sounds pretty happening. You know, if somebody was executing that sort of idea and I was listening, I'd be like, oh, this person has some stuff together. And not that our goal is to sort of sound like hip in a sort of like, you know, ostentatious way. We just want to have access to that sort of full pantheon of the melodic possibilities that we can use as improvisers. So that's everything for today, these 4 ideas. As I said, I don't think the goal is to sound hip. And a lot of times, the more you try to sound hip, the less you do. You just sound contrived. But it's all about finding these simple ways to work some complexity, to work some depth into your ideas and see where they can take you and see how they can enhance the foundational things that you already have together. All right, I'll see you in the woodshed. And don't forget to go hit like on Paper Canaries, Facebook, Instagram. It's down there. Help me out. Thanks. Woodshed. See ya.